The Slack notification appeared while I was fixing the problem they said only I understood. Gray rain pressed against my apartment windows. My second cup of coffee had already gone cold beside the keyboard. On the shared operations channel, Tyler Brennan reacted to my overnight server recovery report with a thumbs-up emoji. Then, 14 seconds later, HR removed me from the workspace. No call. No meeting. Just a private message from Tyler. Thanks again for helping on board, Kyle. We're moving in a different direction operationally. Operationally. Interesting word for replacing a senior systems architect with your brother-in-law. I stared at the message for a few seconds while the backup synchronization logs continued scrolling across my second monitor. Then I closed the laptop. Because Tyler still thought the infrastructure belonged to the company. If you enjoy stories where quiet competence finally stops protecting arrogant people from consequences, hit like and subscribe. Some systems survive because one exhausted person keeps waking up before dawn to hold them together. My name was Evelyn Ward. I was 46 years old, and for 9 years I built the remote operational infrastructure that kept Norvale Commerce Group alive during the exact period executives congratulated themselves for scaling digitally. Which was technically true. They did scale digitally. Mostly because I built the digital part. Norvale started as a regional wholesale distributor selling office products and industrial supplies across the Midwest. By the time I joined, they were trying to reinvent themselves as a national e-commerce fulfillment company because every executive in America suddenly wanted to become Amazon after reading one business article. The problem was they had the technological architecture of a confused strip mall. Different departments used different inventory systems. Order processing ran through 3 disconnected databases. Vendor synchronization happened through overnight CSV imports held together with scheduling scripts written by people who no longer worked there. Every morning began with minor disasters. Missing invoices. Duplicate shipment IDs. Payment authorization failures. Inventory drift. Not catastrophic individually. That's what made them dangerous. Corporate systems rarely collapse all at once. They decay quietly while leadership mistakes survival for stability. I started at Norvale as a remote integration analyst in year 2 of their digital transition initiative, which sounded temporary and harmless. It wasn't. Within 6 months, I realized nobody actually understood how data moved through the company. They had processes, lots of them, but no unified operational architecture. Imagine a hospital where every department uses different blood types and nobody notices because the patients haven't died yet. That was Norvale. I spent my first year mapping their infrastructure manually. Not because anyone assigned me to, because every time something failed, executives asked the same useless question. Who touched the system last? Wrong question. The real question was always, which dependency chain broke first? So I built the dependency resolution matrix. Officially, the DRM was a back-end synchronization framework coordinating transaction validation, vendor reconciliation, warehouse allocation timing, and customer fulfillment logic across all company platforms. Unofficially, it was the circulatory system of the entire business. And I built most of it alone, not the software itself. We licensed plenty of third-party tools. But the connective architecture between them belonged to me. I designed the synchronization rules. I built the escalation hierarchies. I wrote the exception handling protocols. I configured the redundancy triggers that prevented overnight inventory corruption during traffic spikes. Most importantly, I created the dynamic recovery environment. That was the weapon. The DIR existed because year 3 nearly destroyed the company. A server migration failed during holiday order volume and corrupted 61,000 active transactions across 3 fulfillment regions. Executives panicked immediately because nobody could explain which orders were valid anymore. Customer service queues exploded. Warehouse releases froze. Payment reversals triggered fraud flags with 2 major banks. One board member actually asked whether we could just reboot the cloud. That sentence stayed with me for years. I fixed the crisis by building a secondary rollback environment capable of reconstructing transaction integrity from fragmented system logs across disconnected databases. It took 72 hours. I slept twice. Afterward, The CEO publicly credited team collaboration and organizational resilience. Naturally, nobody ever throws parties for the woman staring at raw SQL tables at 3 a.m. while executives practice gratitude speeches. Still, they gave me authority afterward. Not visibly. Not officially. Operationally. Every major system integration eventually routed through my credential approvals because I was the only person who fully understood how the recovery environment interacted with the synchronization layers underneath the company. The DIRI required live authentication mapping between 14 active platforms, order management, vendor fulfillment, payment reconciliation, warehouse allocation, returns processing. Each environment contained conditional rollback logic tied to encryption certificates registered under my senior systems credential. Mine, not Norvale's. That distinction mattered later. Remote work suited me because infrastructure work rewards focus more than personality. I converted the second bedroom of my apartment into an office years earlier. Dual monitors, whiteboards, network diagrams taped beside the wall clock. Soft hum from the cooling fan beneath my desk. Most days smelled like coffee and warm electronics. I liked that. The company culture before Tyler arrived was chaotic but survivable. Executives mostly ignored technology operations unless something broke publicly, which honestly worked in my favor. Nobody micromanages the plumbing while the water still runs. Our remote operations team became strangely close over the years too. Lena from cybersecurity sent everyone photos of her golden retriever during outage calls. Marcus from warehouse integrations cursed at APIs like they personally insulted his family. Jared in payment systems once stayed awake for 31 straight hours helping me isolate a transaction loop during Black Friday failures. Competent people develop loyalty through shared disasters. That's the real version of team building. By year 6, Norvale's entire e-commerce growth depended on infrastructure I built quietly beneath executive presentations. Revenue increased 340%. Fulfillment error rates dropped below 0.8%. System downtime decreased 71%. Executives called it transformation. I called it removing obvious problems before they became expensive. Then Tyler Brennan arrived. Vice President of Digital Expansion. 38 years old. Thick dark hair styled like a real estate agent in a luxury condo advertisement. Expensive quarter zips. White teeth. Watches large enough to suggest insecurity. He spoke fast. Not intelligently. Confidently. Important difference. Tyler came from a venture-backed startup that sold predictive commerce optimization tools before collapsing during a funding freeze. Norvale hired him anyway because executives confuse surviving presentations with surviving consequences. His first company-wide Zoom meeting told me almost everything. We need to rethink operational ownership, he said while sitting in front of decorative bookshelves clearly arranged by an interior designer. Too much institutional dependency creates innovation bottlenecks. Innovation bottlenecks. Interesting phrase for one woman prevents our systems from exploding nightly. Tyler loved management vocabulary. Agile scalability. Adaptive visibility. Distributed accountability. Nobody in actual systems operations trusted him after week 1. Because competent technical people can usually identify performative expertise within minutes. Tyler asked broad questions without understanding the answers. What exactly does the recovery environment do? It reconstructs transactional integrity during synchronization failures. Right, but strategically. Strategically. Like databases cared about leadership philosophy. At first, I assumed he'd eventually learn enough to become useful. Then he hired Kyle. Kyle Mercer. Age 29. Fresh MBA. Tyler's brother-in-law. Though nobody officially said that part immediately. Kyle wore hoodies during executive meetings because startup culture convinced younger managers professionalism was oppression. He had pale blue eyes, immaculate stubble, and the permanent confidence of someone who had never been held responsible for failure. His LinkedIn profile described him as a systems innovation specialist, which turned out to mean he once managed Shopify plugins for a vitamin subscription company. Tyler introduced him during an all-hands video call. Kyle brings a fresh perspective to operational modernization. Translation. Kyle arrived because Thanksgiving dinners become awkward when unemployed relatives ask questions. During his second week, Kyle joined one of my recovery environment briefings. I shared architecture diagrams explaining synchronization sequencing between payment validation layers and warehouse release protocols. Kyle interrupted halfway through. Couldn't we just centralize all this into one dashboard? Silence. Marcus muted himself because he was laughing. I looked at Kyle's webcam square for a few seconds. What exactly do you think the dashboard would control? He shrugged casually. The system. The system. Singular. That told me immediately he didn't understand there were 14 independent systems communicating through layered reconciliation protocols. Tyler jumped in quickly. I think Kyle's point is that complexity often masks inefficiency. There it was. People like Tyler always believe complexity exists because engineers enjoy suffering, not because reality contains moving parts. Over the next month, Tyler launched what he called the Digital Simplification Initiative. Another executive phrase that usually means someone important stopped understanding something technical and decided the technical thing must therefore be unnecessary. He consolidated escalation channels, reduced overnight monitoring staff, compressed validation redundancies. Each decision saved small amounts of money while increasing hidden operational risk. Exactly the kind of trade-off executives love because consequences arrive later. Meanwhile, I kept compensating quietly underneath the changes. I expanded rollback intervals manually, adjusted synchronization thresholds, created hidden backup verification scripts to catch errors before they reached live environments. Nobody noticed because nothing failed publicly. Success always looks effortless to people insulated from failure. Then came the acquisition push. Norvale landed negotiations with a massive national retail consortium called Bellamy Industrial Supply. If approved, the contract would triple company revenue within 18 months. There was only one problem. Norvale's infrastructure couldn't survive Bellamy's transaction volume without major stabilization upgrades. I knew that because I built the infrastructure. Tyler ignored me immediately. We can't keep operating from fear-based assumptions, he said during one executive call. Fear-based assumptions. Interesting description for mathematical limitations. I presented detailed capacity reports anyway. Projected synchronization strain. Payment latency risks. Rollback saturation thresholds. Actual numbers. Tyler responded with a smile that looked professionally rehearsed. I appreciate the caution, Evelyn. But modern systems scale dynamically. No. Cloud hosting scales dynamically. Bad architecture scales catastrophically. Very different concepts. 2 weeks later, Tyler scheduled a private Zoom meeting with HR. I already knew. People think remote firings feel less obvious because nobody physically escorts you out of a building. They're wrong. You can hear termination in someone's breathing pattern before the meeting even starts. The HR representative smiled too carefully. Tyler folded his hands. After reviewing operational strategy, we've decided to restructure the systems architecture division. Restructure. Corporate language remains fascinating during cowardice. Kyle will transition into a newly expanded leadership role overseeing recovery systems modernization. There it was. Not subtle. Tyler continued. We'd really value your help during the transition process. Translation. Please train the man replacing you before we eliminate your access credentials. I muted myself briefly and drank coffee. Still warm then. What exactly requires transition? I asked. Tyler smiled. The recovery framework architecture. Interesting answer. Because from Tyler's perspective, the DRE belonged to Norvale. What he didn't understand was the dynamic recovery environment depended on certificate authentication layers registered under my federally compliant systems credential through the Transaction Integrity Oversight Program. The company owned the software licenses. I owned the operational certification environment validating the rollback architecture. Without that certification chain, the DRE entered limited compliance mode automatically after 90 days. Meaning transaction reconstruction capacity dropped by 73%. Tyler had no idea. Because nobody besides me ever read the compliance appendix attached to the system authorization agreement 6 years earlier. They thought the system worked because software existed. What they didn't know was the software legally required certified oversight mapping to maintain full recovery authorization during high-volume processing. And I was the certification authority. Still, I accepted the transition period calmly. 30 days. Tyler visibly relaxed. People always mistake emotional restraint for surrender. The training began Monday. Kyle joined daily infrastructure calls from his expensive apartment downtown. Brick walls behind him. Decorative vinyl records. Plants he clearly forgot to water regularly. At first, he tried sounding technical. How does the transactional reconciliation architecture interface with warehouse latency? Real engineers never talk like that. They're too busy solving problems. I trained him professionally anyway. How synchronization failures propagate across systems. How payment reversals create inventory distortions. Why warehouse allocation timing matters during vendor congestion. I explained rollback sequencing carefully. Showed him recovery escalation pathways. Documented exception handling logic. Not because he deserved it. Because competence remains competence even when surrounded by stupidity. Around day 8, Kyle asked something interesting. So why didn't the company automate more of this years ago? I leaned back in my chair. Because automation magnifies bad assumptions. He frowned slightly. But scalable systems should reduce human dependency. There was Tyler talking through him again. Yes, I said. If the people designing them understand the system. Kyle nodded like he understood. He didn't. That became obvious during week 2. A payment reconciliation loop triggered duplicate refund authorizations during overnight vendor processing. Minor issue. Routine correction. Kyle suggested disabling the rollback queue temporarily to reduce processing clutter. That would have corrupted 11,000 active transactions across 3 fulfillment regions. I stopped him before he touched anything. You don't disable rollback during active reconciliation, I said. Why not? Because reality isn't a PowerPoint slide, Kyle. Instead, I said, because the queue is protecting transaction integrity while the systems rebalance. He stared silently for a moment. Then typed notes aggressively. Interesting reaction. People who don't understand systems often compensate by writing things down harder. Tyler remained enthusiastic throughout the transition. Every leadership meeting included phrases like fresh operational perspective and modernized infrastructure thinking. Meanwhile, actual engineers started messaging me privately. Marcus. He's going to kill the recovery environment. Lena. Does Tyler understand Kyle can't troubleshoot production failures alone? Jared. I'm updating my resume. That last message mattered. Competent people recognize instability before executives do. By day 17, Tyler reduced overnight monitoring requirements again to improve operational efficiency metrics, which meant fewer live eyes watching synchronization drift during Bellamy onboarding tests. So I quietly expanded hidden alert thresholds underneath the environment. Not sabotage. Protection. I still cared whether the system survived. Even then, the Bellamy integration stress tests began during week 3. Simulated high-volume transaction loads across all active fulfillment regions. The results were ugly. Payment latency spikes. Inventory drift variance. Synchronization queue saturation. I presented the data during a remote leadership review. Tyler smiled the entire time. Stress testing naturally exaggerates edge case instability. Edge case instability. Interesting phrase for the infrastructure almost caught fire digitally. Then Kyle spoke. I actually think some of these concerns come from legacy configuration thinking. Legacy configuration thinking. I muted myself briefly because laughing directly into executive meetings tends to complicate employment. Afterward, Marcus called me privately. Tell me he's not really taking over the DRE. He is. Long silence. Then, oh, this company is dead. Not dramatically. Factually. That's the thing about experienced technical workers. They can smell structural collapse early. Like electricians hearing bad wiring inside walls. The final week arrived strangely quietly. Tyler scheduled fewer meetings because executives become uncomfortable near people they're preparing to discard. Kyle became more confident too. Dangerously confident. He started correcting engineers during calls despite barely understanding the infrastructure diagrams. One afternoon, he interrupted Lena mid-sentence. We don't need redundant rollback logging if the cloud environment is stable. Lena blinked slowly. You realize rollback logs exist because cloud environments aren't stable under transactional fragmentation, right? Kyle smiled patiently. Well, that's one philosophy. Philosophy. Interesting word for mathematical certainty. Even Tyler looked uncomfortable during that exchange. Day 29 brought the first real warning sign. Bellamy's onboarding simulation triggered queue instability across vendor reconciliation layers during a high-volume stress pass. The DRE caught the failure correctly, but Call couldn't interpret the recovery logs. I watched him scrolling through transaction maps during a shared screen session while his jaw tightened slightly. What exactly are we looking at? He asked. There it was. The moment. Not understanding. Realizing he didn't understand. I explained the recovery sequence calmly. Again. Tyler jumped into the call halfway through. Everything manageable? I answered honestly. For now. That phrase landed harder than I intended. Because Tyler suddenly looked uncertain. Just briefly. People like Tyler survive through narrative control. Any sentence they can't immediately simplify unsettles them. Day 30 ended with a mandatory transition wrap-up meeting. Virtual, naturally. Corporate cowardice loves remote infrastructure. Tyler congratulated everyone for maintaining professionalism during organizational evolution. Kyle thanked me for the training. That part almost impressed me. At least he knew enough to recognize he needed it. Then Tyler added one final sentence. We're excited to move into a more agile operational future. Agile operational future. I logged off 5 minutes later. No anger. No speech. I made pasta instead. Garlic and olive oil. Simple. Quiet. Then I opened my personal laptop at 9:14 p.m. and activated the weapon. Again, not dramatically. Just professionally. The Transaction Integrity Oversight Program maintained compliance authority through a secure federal credential environment tied to high-volume financial reconciliation systems. Most companies outsource the process. Norvale used mine because I built their certification architecture during year 4 after a vendor audit nearly suspended payment processing authority. I logged into the oversight portal. Organization. Norvale Commerce Group. Recovery Certification Environment. Active. I selected Compliance Separation Filing. Reason. Termination of Certified Oversight Authority. Then I initiated credential withdrawal from active transactional recovery authorization effective in 72 hours. Not system shutdown. That would have been illegal and reckless. No. I simply removed my federally compliant oversight certification from the recovery environment, which triggered automatic operational downgrading under federal transaction reconstruction guidelines. The system generated 4 notices automatically. Norvale Executive Operations. Financial Compliance Oversight. Bellamy Onboarding Audit Division. Third-party Payment Integrity Monitors. I uploaded the required documentation. Termination Notice. Credential Withdrawal Declaration. Recovery Authority Discontinuation Forms. At 9:41 p.m., confirmation arrived. At 10:03, compliance acknowledgement processed. Then silence, which told me nobody understood what they just received. I slept perfectly. The firing happened officially the next morning. Slack notification. Access removal. Tyler's message. No phone call. Interesting how executives remove humanity from layoffs while still expecting loyalty afterward. I made fresh coffee and walked to the balcony while rain moved across the city below. The trap was already active. Monday morning, the first issue appeared. Compliance mode warning. Dynamic recovery environment operating under provisional certification status. Kyle messaged me at 8:14 a.m. Quick question about the compliance notice we received. I didn't answer. By noon, Tyler emailed. Subject: urgent clarification needed. Interesting tone shift. Tuesday brought the second stage. Bellamy's audit team flagged Norvale's onboarding environment for conditional recovery limitations during high-volume transactional events. Translation. Your infrastructure no longer meets enterprise-scale recovery standards. Tyler called 3 times before lunch. No voicemail initially. Executives hate leaving evidence while they still believe problems remain temporary. Wednesday morning changed that. A vendor synchronization failure triggered duplicate inventory reservations during live Bellamy integration testing. Normally, the DRE would have reconstructed the queue automatically within 11 minutes. Instead, the downgraded recovery environment entered partial verification mode. Transaction rebuild time increased from 11 minutes to 4.8 hours. Warehouse releases froze. Payment holds activated. Vendor reconciliation queues backed up across 3 regions. Marcus texted me at 2:17 p.m. It's happening. Then another message. Kyle has no idea what the recovery logs mean. I made soup for lunch while my phone buzzed continuously across the counter. Tyler finally left voicemail around 4 o'clock. Evelyn, we need to discuss the certification environment immediately. There seems to be some confusion regarding your oversight withdrawal. Confusion. Interesting word for federally documented compliance degradation. Thursday morning brought panic. Bellamy suspended active onboarding tests pending infrastructure reassessment. That was bad. Very bad. Norvale already projected the Bellamy acquisition publicly during investor guidance calls. Stock analysts expected expansion revenue. Board members expected growth bonuses. Tyler expected promotion leverage. Now the onboarding stalled because the transaction recovery environment no longer met enterprise certification requirements. At 7:11 a.m., Tyler called again. No executive confidence left in his voice now. Just fatigue. Evelyn, call me back. Please. Please. There it was. Meanwhile, Kyle started trying things. Always dangerous. First, he attempted bypassing the provisional recovery limitations manually. Failed. The compliance architecture blocked unauthorized override attempts automatically. Then he tried rebuilding certification chains using archived credential backups. Impossible. The oversight credentials linked directly to my active federal registration environment through encrypted validation keys. You can't duplicate certified oversight authority by copying folders. That's not how compliance systems work. By Friday, the entire operations department understood what happened. Lena called me privately from her car. I could hear windshield wipers in the background. You really built the certification environment under your credentials? Yes. Long pause. Oh my God. Interesting reaction. Not anger. Recognition. Because competent technical people understand what executives usually don't. Infrastructure authority matters more than org charts. Then she said the sentence that landed hardest. They fired the only person legally allowed to stabilize the recovery environment. Exactly. That afternoon, Bellamy's audit representatives arrived virtually for emergency review meetings. Norvale executives spent 6 hours trying to explain the certification issue without admitting they terminated the architect controlling the compliance framework. Good luck with that. Saturday morning, Tyler sent 7 emails between 6 a.m. and 11 a.m. Subject: Need immediate assistance. Subject: Temporary consulting discussion. Subject: Bellamy escalation risk. Subject: Please respond. That last one always arrives eventually. I still didn't answer. Instead, I spent Saturday reorganizing my office and watching old detective movies while rain moved softly against the windows. The best part about competent revenge is how ordinary life feels during escalation. You're making tea while executives experience cardiac-level panic through Microsoft Teams. Monday brought catastrophe. Bellamy initiated a full infrastructure review after another synchronization failure corrupted 19,000 onboarding transactions during a stress volume simulation. Not permanent corruption. Recoverable corruption. Huge difference. Except Norvale couldn't recover efficiently anymore. Because the DRE operated at limited certification capacity. Queue rebuild times stretched past 9 hours. Payment authorization delays triggered fraud protections. Vendor synchronization logs fragmented during rollback attempts. At 1:43 p.m., Marcus sent me a screenshot. Emergency executive meeting. 27 participants. Tyler visibly sweating on camera. Then another message. Nobody can rebuild the recovery maps. There was the gut punch. Because of course they couldn't. The recovery maps weren't just diagrams. They were layered behavioral logic structures built over 6 years of accumulated transactional anomalies. Half the stabilization sequences existed because I recognized recurring system behavior before failures became visible. Transaction congestion during overnight vendor resets. Rollback conflicts during warehouse latency spikes. Payment drift after inventory fragmentation events. The Deary learned from me because I built it through years of operational scar tissue. And now it was degrading in real time. Wednesday morning, Bellamy officially paused acquisition negotiations. Publicly, they cited infrastructure certification concerns. Norvale stock dropped 23% by market close. Tyler called 11 times that day. Voicemails became increasingly specific. Evelyn, we just need temporary consulting guidance. Whatever the certification issue is, we can resolve it professionally. Then finally, we didn't realize the recovery authority was tied to you personally. No, you didn't realize competent people sometimes become load-bearing infrastructure. Thursday afternoon, the board entered the crisis. That changed everything immediately. Executives can ignore engineers. They cannot ignore investors. A special oversight committee demanded direct explanations regarding the certification collapse. Tyler tried framing it as a transitional compliance misunderstanding. Unfortunately for him, federal documentation existed. My documentation. Compliance filings. Oversight declarations. Credential withdrawal notices. Everything timestamped. Everything acknowledged. Everything legal. The board finally understood the scale of the mistake. By Friday, Norvale's general counsel contacted me directly. Professional tone. Very careful wording. They requested an emergency consultation meeting. I declined initially. Not emotionally. Strategically. Because desperation clarifies negotiations. The real collapse arrived 2 weeks later. Bellamy terminated acquisition discussions entirely. Gone. Projected revenue evaporated overnight. Norvale lost $280 million in future market valuation within 72 hours. 3 investors filed governance complaints. 2 board members resigned. An external compliance review began investigating infrastructure oversight failures. The irony was almost elegant. They eliminated my role to reduce operational dependency costs. Now the dependency failure threatened the entire company. Then came the confrontation. Officially, it was called an Emergency Infrastructure Recovery Summit, which sounded dramatic enough to deserve movie trailer music. In reality, it happened inside a glass conference room overlooking downtown while exhausted executives drank terrible coffee and tried not to sound terrified. They flew me in first class. Interesting detail. Companies become very respectful once consequences gain decimal points. I arrived wearing a charcoal blazer and carrying 1 laptop bag. Tyler looked awful. Wrinkled shirt. Bloodshot eyes. Voice slightly hoarse. Panic changes people physically. Kyle sat beside him staring at printed recovery diagrams like they might suddenly explain themselves through guilt. The board chairwoman, Diane Hollowell, opened the meeting immediately. "Ms. Ward," she said, "we need a clear understanding of the recovery certification situation." I connected my laptop calmly. Projected the compliance architecture. Displayed the certification hierarchy. Opened the federal oversight documentation. Then I explained exactly what happened. The dynamic recovery environment required active certified oversight authority to maintain enterprise-scale transaction reconstruction compliance under high-volume financial reconciliation standards. My credentials provided that authority. Once Norvale terminated my operational role, federal compliance rules required me to withdraw oversight certification. Without certified oversight, the Deary automatically downgraded recovery capacity. Not sabotage. Regulation. Silence filled the room afterward. Actual silence. I could hear HVAC airflow above the conference table. Then Diane asked the obvious question. Why didn't executive leadership understand this before termination? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Tyler spoke quietly. We believed the certification belonged to the system environment itself. There it was. The misunderstanding at the center of everything. Executives always think systems are self-sustaining because they only encounter them after competent people stabilize them. Diane looked furious. Not theatrical fury. Expensive fury. The kind that threatens bonuses and careers. Kyle finally spoke then. Voice smaller now. Can the certification be restored? I looked at him carefully. Interesting moment. Because for the first time since meeting him, he looked like someone realizing confidence doesn't substitute for understanding. Yes, I said. Hope moved visibly across the room. Then I continued. Under new oversight terms. Tyler leaned forward immediately. What terms? I folded my hands. Full independent authority over recovery operations. Direct board-level reporting access. Reinstatement of the monitoring redundancies removed during the simplification initiative. Diane nodded before I finished speaking. Done. Tyler looked physically ill. Because now the board understood exactly who caused the collapse. I continued calmly. Additionally, all Bellamy recovery negotiations moved through my office exclusively. No objections. That part amused me slightly. 6 weeks earlier, Tyler removed me through Slack. Now the board was prepared to reorganize operational authority just to keep the company alive. Then Tyler asked the question he probably regretted immediately afterward. Evelyn, why didn't you warn us this would happen? Interesting. Because I had. Repeatedly. I opened another folder. Emails. Compliance notices. Infrastructure risk assessments. Certification dependency explanations. Timestamped across 4 years. The room stayed quiet while Tyler stared at the documents. Then I answered. I did. No anger. No speech. Just fact. That landed harder. The recovery contract took effect 48 hours later. Not employment. Consulting authority. At $1,200 per hour. Interesting how companies suddenly discover budget flexibility once incompetence becomes measurable. I rebuilt the recovery certification chains over 9 days. Restored enterprise transaction capacity. Reactivated full rollback authority. Reconfigured synchronization monitoring. Marcus returned immediately after hearing I resumed operational control. Lena 2. Competent people follow stability naturally. Bellamy reopened negotiations 3 months later under revised infrastructure guarantees. Norvale survived technically, but not intact. Tyler resigned before the fiscal year ended, officially to pursue new strategic opportunities. Of course, Kyle disappeared into some internal analytics role where hopefully nobody allowed him near transactional infrastructure again. The permanent damage remained enormous. Norvale lost $46 million during the failed onboarding period. Stock value dropped 38%. Federal auditors imposed mandatory oversight restructuring. 3 enterprise clients delayed expansion contracts after the compliance failures became public. All because executives mistook invisible competence for replaceable labor. The funniest part? They fired me to save $90,000 annually. The recovery consulting contract alone exceeded $2.4 million within 8 months. Eventually, I left anyway. Not dramatically. Just permanently. A cybersecurity infrastructure firm in Seattle recruited me to lead enterprise recovery architecture across national payment networks. Smarter people. Cleaner systems. No executives using the phrase innovation bottleneck while misunderstanding databases. My new office overlooked Elliott Bay. Rainy mornings. Cargo ships in the distance. Quiet hum from secure server environments beneath the floor. I liked it immediately. The work felt calmer there. Not because the systems were simpler. Because leadership respected the people maintaining them. One evening nearly 2 years later, I received a LinkedIn alert while reviewing transaction resilience reports. Norvale Commerce completes multi-year compliance restructure. I opened the article. Buried halfway through was a sentence crediting external recovery leadership for stabilizing the company's enterprise infrastructure after the Bellamy collapse. No names. Naturally. Companies rarely memorialize the people who save them from executive stupidity. Still, I smiled. Because the systems were stable again. The infrastructure worked. The competent people survived. And somewhere inside Norvale's executive offices, someone probably still flinched slightly every time Slack notifications appeared unexpectedly. That part felt satisfying. Later that night, rain tapped softly against the office windows while transaction dashboards glowed green across my monitors. Healthy systems. Balanced load distribution. No emergency recovery alerts. My junior architect knocked gently on the open office door. You heading out soon? In a minute. She glanced toward the monitoring wall. Everything good? I looked at the recovery environment metrics for a few seconds. Steady synchronization. Clean rollback pathways. No fragmentation warnings. For once, yes. Stable enough, I said. And that was the thing Tyler never understood until it cost him everything. Infrastructure doesn't fail because competent people become emotional. It fails because eventually they stop standing between the company and its own arrogance. If you've ever watched loyalty get rewarded with a Slack termination while management congratulated themselves for being efficient, leave a comment. And if you enjoy stories where quiet competence finally lets gravity do the teaching, like and subscribe. Somewhere tonight, another executive is firing the only person who actually knows where the emergency exits are.